Dark clouds swirled overhead, casting eerie shadows across the open plains. The wind howled through the skeletal branches of the towering pines, bending them as if whispering secrets to the night. Rain clung to Eleanor Whitmore's lashes, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she urged her horse faster, its hooves pounding against the sodden earth. She didn't dare look back. Somewhere behind her, the sound of pursuit cut through the wind, the sharp crack of branches, the distant voices of men, the thunder of hooves gaining ground. Her father's men. They had found her trail. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed her body lower against the horse's damp coat. The pain in her side where she had fallen earlier was sharp, but she bit back a cry. There was no time for pain, no time for fear, only escape. A week ago, she had been draped in silk, her hands folded in her lap as she sat obediently before her father's desk. He had spoken of duty, of alliance, of the great fortune her marriage would bring. She had heard none of it, only the cold certainty of her fate sinking like iron in her chest. He had chosen for her, as he always had, and she had smiled, as she always did. That night she had fled. The first drops of rain had barely fallen when her horse lurched to a stop, nostrils flaring. Eleanor's pulse spiked as she tugged at the reins, trying to push forward, but the animal's ears flattened. It sensed something she couldn't see. Then a rifle cracked through the storm. The shot whistled past her ear, and Eleanor flinched, digging her heels into the horse's sides. The beast reared, then bolted. A second shot rang out, splintering the bark of a nearby tree. Voices now closer. There! She's headed toward the ravine. Mud splashed against her dress as she rode hard, her fingers numb around the reins. The ravine. If she reached it first, she could lose them. If not, another shot. This one struck her horse. A scream tore from Eleanor's throat as the animal stumbled, its legs buckling beneath it. She barely had time to throw herself clear before it collapsed in the mud, its breast shallow, blood pooling beneath its body. She hit the ground hard, pain lancing through her shoulder, but she forced herself to move. Struggling to her feet, she staggered into the forest, branches clawing at her arms, her vision swimming. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the vast darkness ahead. No paths, no trails, only trees twisted into gnarled shadows. She pressed forward, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Her dress, once a pristine blue, hung in tattered ribbons around her knees, soaked with rain and dirt. She could no longer hear the men behind her. Had she lost them? A sudden silence settled over the forest, thick and unnatural. Eleanor slowed her steps, chest rising and falling in rapid rhythm. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then she saw it. Ahead, the remains of a battlefield stretched before her, half hidden by the creeping fog. Tents lay in tatters, their canvas shredded and stained dark. Broken rifles and spent cartridges littered the earth. The scent of charred wood and something else, something coppery and thick, hung in the damp air. Her pulse pounded. This wasn't just a camp. It was the aftermath of something brutal. Eleanor took a step forward, the mud sucking at her boots. The ground was uneven, disturbed by the weight of bodies that had once struggled here. Some still did. A groan, low, guttural. She froze. Her eyes darted toward the source of the sound. A figure slumped against a fallen tree, half hidden by the underbrush. His face was streaked with blood, his dark hair matted to his forehead. His chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, the unmistakable gleam of a knife resting loosely in his fingers. She stepped backward, hard in her throat. A twig snapped beneath her foot. The man's eyes snapped open. Eleanor turned to run, but something cold pressed against the back of her neck. A barrel, steady and unyielding. "Move!" A voice growled. Her breath hitched. Slowly she turned. A second man loomed over her, the rifle in his hands unwavering. His face was obscured by the shadows of his wide-brimmed hat, but his stance spoke volumes. A man accustomed to danger. A man who had seen death and had no fear of it. Eleanor swallowed hard, her mind racing. These weren't her father's men. They weren't bounty hunters. They were something else entirely. The man with the rifle studied her, his gaze cold and assessing. Then, without a word, he lifted his chin toward the wounded figure against a tree. "Help him," he ordered. Eleanor's breath shuddered from her lips. "I don't." The rifle cocked. "I wasn't asking." Thunder rumbled in the distance. The rain continued to fall. Eleanor looked between them. The wounded warrior, the rifleman, and the path she had come from. There was no way out. With slow, trembling hands, she knelt beside the man against a tree. His eyes, dark and sharp despite the pain, tracked her every movement. There was something about them, something unrelenting, a warning. A deep scar ran along his jaw, disappearing beneath the blood and grime. His breathing was labored, each inhale a battle of its own. Her hands hovered uncertainly. "I don't know how." "You'll learn," the rifleman muttered. Eleanor bit her lip, pressing her palms against a wounded man's chest, feeling the heat of his fever beneath her fingertips. Her heart pounded. She had escaped one prison, only to stumble into another. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the three of them, strangers bound by a moment neither of them had foreseen. And somewhere, just beyond the trees, the past was still hunting her. The fire crackled in the small cabin, its glow casting flickering shadows against the rough-hewn walls. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with damp earth and the distant scent of pine. Eleanor sat stiffly near the door, her wrists bound before her, her breath shallow as she watched the two men across the room. The wounded one, the warrior, sat propped against a wooden beam, his breathing steady but strained. His dark eyes flicked to her every so often, unreadable, weighing her presence as if she were another battle he had yet to fight. The other man, the one with the rifle, stood beside the fire, methodically cleaning the mud from his weapon with slow, practiced movements. Neither had spoken in some time. Eleanor's wrists ached against the rough rope, but she refused to let them see her struggle. She wasn't afraid, not exactly. Fear had been her constant companion since the moment she fled her father's house, and she had learned to swallow it down like bitter medicine. But this was something else. These men were not her father's men, not bounty hunters, not lawmen. They were something in between, shadows of a world she had never known. The rifleman finally broke the silence. "Who's after you?" His voice was low, unhurried. Not a question, but a test. Eleanor kept her chin high. "No one." The warrior let out a quiet breath, half a laugh, half a scoff. He had barely spoken since she had tended his wound, but his presence was heavy, his silence more dangerous than words. The rifleman's gaze flicked toward his companion, before returning to her. "Your dress says different. So does the way you ride. You're not running for the thrill of it." Eleanor swallowed hard. She had spent years perfecting the art of silence, of saying only what was expected. But this was different. There was no society here, no expectation of civility. The truth felt like a loaded gun in her hands, dangerous no matter where she aimed it. "I left home," she admitted, keeping her voice steady. The rifleman's lips curved slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "Left or ran?" Eleanor didn't answer. The warrior shifted against the beam, his eyes dark slashes against his tanned skin. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps only a few years older than herself. His hands, resting loosely on his lap, were scarred, his body lean and taut with the kind of strength that came from hardship, not privilege. He finally spoke, his voice quieter than the other man's, but no less commanding. "Where's home?" Eleanor hesitated. Saying out loud felt like calling it back to her, as if her father's reach extended even here, into the dark corners of the wilderness. "Far from here," she said carefully. The warrior studied her. "And the men hunting you?" Her throat tightened. "They are no concern of yours." That earned a reaction. The rifleman chuckled, shaking his head as he set his rifle aside. "That's so." He nodded toward the door. "Because judging by the way you came tearing through the forest, I'd say they're a fair concern." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "What do you want?" It was a question that had been circling in her mind since they had taken her. If they meant to kill her, they would have done it already. If they meant to ransom her, she doubted they would have wasted time stitching up the wounded man's side while keeping her alive. The rifleman leaned against the table, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm James Carver. Some call me Red Hawk. And my friend over there is Tanita. You may have heard of us." Eleanor shook her head. That seemed to amuse him. Good. He tilted his head. And you? Got a name, or should we keep calling you the girl who ran? Her jaw tightened, but there was no use in hiding it. Eleanor. Red Hawk nodded as if filing it away. Well, Eleanor, here's the trouble. Your presence complicates things. You came stumbling into our camp like a lost deer, and now whoever's after you, whether you want to admit it or not, will come looking. And that, you see, puts us in a rather difficult position. He was circling her with words, testing, probing. Eleanor straightened, refusing to shrink beneath his gaze. If I'm such a burden, then let me go. Red Hawk smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You misunderstand. You see, letting you go means sending you straight into the arms of whoever you're running from. And I can't have that. Not yet. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Why? The warrior, Tanita, shifted slightly. He hadn't moved much, but every glance, every measured breath, felt like its own language. Because he thinks you're useful. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Red Hawk sighed, rubbing his jaw. I wouldn't say useful. More like advantageous. His gaze darkened slightly. Your father, I assume, is a man of means? Eleanor's mouth went dry. He nodded as if she had spoken aloud. Thought so. That means he'll come for you. And when he does, I want to be ready. She felt her blood turn cold. You're going to ransom me? Red Hawk gave a short laugh. No, but leverage? That's something different. A gust of wind rattled the cabin walls. The fire flickered, and for a moment, only silence stretched between them. Eleanor turned her eyes to Tanita, but he offered no relief. He simply watched her, unmoving, unreadable. She forced herself to take a steady breath. And if I refuse to cooperate? Red Hawk exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. That's the thing about survival, Eleanor. It don't much care for what you refuse. The truth of it settled in her bones like ice. She had spent so long believing escape meant freedom. But now she saw the world beyond her father's house, beyond the gilded walls of polite society. It was not a place of safety. It was a place of wolves. A sharp knock rattled the door. The cabin fell silent. Eleanor's breath hitched as Red Hawk exchanged a look with Tanita, his expression shifting in an instant. He grabbed his rifle, motioning for silence. Outside, the knock came again, louder this time. A voice followed, low and measured. Carver. Red Hawk's fingers tightened around the barrel. Eleanor's heart pounded. Whoever was on the other side of that door, they weren't a friend. Tanita pushed himself upright, wincing as he tested his weight. He grabbed his knife, his movements careful but precise. Red Hawk motioned for Eleanor to move away from the door, his expression unreadable now. The air in the cabin thickened. The knock came again, slower this time. I know she's in there. Eleanor's stomach clenched. Red Hawk's jaw set. That's so. Outside, boots shifted against a wooden porch. It is... A pause. Then, almost amused, I also know you're not fool enough to think you can keep her. The silence that followed was razor sharp. Eleanor felt it cut through the air, through her skin. Red Hawk didn't move, didn't breathe. Then he smiled, slow and deliberate. Well, he murmured, cocking the rifle. Let's find out. The door shuddered under a heavy fist, the final knock reverberating to the cabin like the toll of a bell. The silence that followed was suffocating. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she watched Red Hawk's fingers flex around the rifle stock, his posture shifting into something coiled and ready. Beside him, Tanita was motionless, his dark eyes locked on the door, his knife poised at his side. The tension between the three of them was electric, their fate balanced on the edge of what came next. A voice, calm but edged with authority, filtered through the heavy wood. I won't ask again. Eleanor didn't recognize it, but she felt the weight of its certainty. Whoever stood on the other side of that door wasn't bluffing. Red Hawk exhaled slowly through his nose. That's the thing about asking, he murmured, mostly to himself. It doesn't mean you like the answer. Then, without warning, he threw the door open. The man outside was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a long coat that had seen better days. His face was lined with age and hard-won experience. his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. But his eyes were sharp, taking in the scene with the precision of a hunter. Behind him, half a dozen men sat astride their horses, rifles resting against their thighs. They were waiting for a signal. Eleanor's stomach turned to stone. Red Hawk leaned lazily against the doorframe, casual but calculated. Afraid you got the wrong place. The man's gaze flicked past him, landing on Eleanor. I don't think I do. Eleanor's pulse thundered. This wasn't one of her father's men. He was something else. Something worse. Red Hawk sighed. Then I suppose we got ourselves a situation. The man's lips curled in something that wasn't quite a smile. That we do. Then the gunfire started. The first shot came from the trees, a sharp crack that sent splinters flying from the cabin's frame. Red Hawk slammed the door shut in an instant, the impact rattling through Eleanor's bones. Down, he barked. She barely had time to react before Tanita grabbed her arm, yanking her toward the floor as another shot tore through the window, glass shattering over them. Eleanor gasped, shielding her face as with splinters bit into her skin. Outside, the men were shouting orders, boots pounding against the dirt as they closed in. The air was thick with the acrid scent of gunpowder, the cabin filled with the echoing thunder of return fire. Red Hawk had taken position by the window, rifle pressed against his shoulder, his expression dark with focus. Eleanor forced herself to breathe, to think. Panic would get her killed. Tanita shifted beside her, pressing a knife into her hand. She looked at him, wide-eyed. What am I supposed to do with this? His voice was calm, even as chaos erupted around them. Survive? The word sent a chill down her spine. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the front door exploded inward. The force of the impact sent Red Hawk staggering back. A man stormed through the wreckage, pistol raised, but before he could fire, Tanita was on him. It happened too fast for Eleanor to fully comprehend. The warrior moved like a shadow, ducking under the man's aim, his knife flashing in the dim firelight. There was a grunt, the sickening sound of steel meeting flesh, and then the attacker crumpled to the floor, blood pooling beneath him. But there was no time to process it. More were coming. Red Hawk was already moving. He grabbed Eleanor's wrist, hauling her to her feet. We have to go. Now. She barely nodded before she was being pulled toward the back door. The cabin was no longer safe, the walls riddled with bullets, the air thick with smoke. Tanita followed, his steps quick despite his injury. They burst into the night, rain still clinging to the air. The forest loomed ahead, dark and unwelcoming, but there was no choice. Behind them, voices shouted, feet pounded against the earth. They ran. Eleanor's legs burned, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The night was alive with danger, gunfire cracking through the trees, bullets biting into bark. She stumbled, but Red Hawk's grip on her wrist was firm, keeping her upright, forcing her forward. Then, ahead, figures. She barely had time to react before the first one lunged. A rough hand caught her arm, jerking her back with brute force. Eleanor yelped, twisting, but the man was stronger, pulling her toward him. A knife flashed. Tanita, his blade sliced clean across the attacker's arm, forcing a howl of pain. Eleanor tore herself free, stumbling back just as Tanita finished the job, his expression unreadable as the man fell motionless at his feet. Red Hawk was already ahead, cutting through the brush, clearing a path. Keep moving. They obeyed, the night swallowing them whole. Eleanor didn't know how long they ran. Time had lost meaning, reduced only to the pounding of her heart and the fire in her lungs. The voices behind them grew distant, then silent. Only then did Red Hawk slow, finally releasing her wrist. They stood in a clearing, breathless, drenched in sweat and rain. The trees stretched high above them, the wind whispering through the leaves. Silence. Tanita turned, scanning the darkness. They won't stop. Red Hawk exhaled, running a hand through his damp hair. No, they won't. Eleanor swallowed hard, forcing herself to steady her breath. Her hands were shaking, though whether from fear or exhaustion, she didn't know. They're after me, she said, the realization heavy on her tongue. They want me. Red Hawk met her gaze, his expression unreadable. No, he said finally. They want what you represent. She frowned, her pulse still racing. And what's that? The corner of his mouth lifted, though there was no humor in it. Power. The word lingered in the air between them. Undeniable. Anita stepped closer, his gaze never leaving her face. If you go back, you die. Eleanor already knew that. She looked at them, these two men, these warriors, caught in the same crossfire as her. She didn't know their past, didn't know the full truth of why they had taken her in, or what game Red Hawk was playing. But one thing was certain. She was no longer just a pawn in someone else's story. Her fate was hers to decide, and if she had to fight for it, then so be it. The dawn crept slowly over the horizon, spilling pale gold light through the thick veil of trees. Mist clung low to the earth, curling around the roots and pooling in the spaces between branches like the last whispers of a fading dream. Eleanor sat near the remnants of the fire, knees pulled to her chest, staring into the dying embers as if they held answers. The night had been long, the chase relentless, but they had survived. Red Hawk sat opposite her, silent, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. His face, usually touched with some wry amusement, was unreadable now, etched with thoughts he had no intention of sharing. Anita was farther off, tending to his wound with practiced efficiency, his every movement precise and controlled. No one spoke. Eleanor turned the knife Anita had given her over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, not just the steel, but the responsibility it carried. She had never wielded a weapon before, never thought she would need to, but that was the world she had come from, one where men fought and women suffered the outcomes. That was not the world she lived in now. She had made a choice last night. To run was no longer enough. If she wanted to survive, she had to fight. Red Hawk finally broke the silence. They'll keep coming. Eleanor didn't flinch. I know. He nodded slightly, as if she had passed a test. You could disappear. Find some settlement far from here. Take another name. Eleanor tightened her grip on the knife. And spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder? She shook her head. That's not living. Anita looked up then, his gaze steady. Then you must be willing to kill. The words hit her like a cold wind. She had seen death, felt the hot spray of it in the darkness. But to take a life by her own hand? She looked between them. Two men who had long since accepted the weight of such choices. Two men who had walked paths she had only just stumbled upon. I don't want to, she admitted, but I will. It was the only answer she had, and it was the truth. Red Hawk smiled slightly, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. That's all survival asks of you. The silence stretched between them again, but this time it was different. Eleanor wasn't just an outsider among them anymore. She was part of this now. A distant sound echoed through the forest, a sharp bird call, unnatural in its precision. Red Hawk and Anita exchanged a glance. They're close, Anita murmured. Eleanor's stomach knotted, but she forced herself to remain still. Fear would not serve her now. Red Hawk flicked his knife shut. We split, different paths. He looked at Eleanor. You follow Anita. He knows the land better. Eleanor hesitated. What about you? His expression darkened. I'll buy us time. There was no point in arguing. He had made up his mind. Anita moved swiftly, gathering supplies, his movements quick but measured. We move now. Eleanor rose, tucking the knife into the belt of her tattered dress. She met Red Hawk's gaze one last time. Don't die, she said, surprising even herself. Red Hawk smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. And then he was gone, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. Anita touched her arm, a rare moment of contact. Come. They moved quickly, slipping between the trees, the forest folding around them like a living thing. Eleanor's heartbeat drummed in time with their footsteps. She forced herself to match his pace, to step where he stepped, to listen the way he did. They didn't speak. The world around them was alive with the rustling of unseen creatures, the whisper of leaves shifting in the breeze. But there was something else. Two, a weight pressing down on them. The knowledge that men with guns hunted them through this wilderness. Eleanor felt the knife at her hip. It felt both foreign and right. Tahanita slowed, signaling her to do the same. They had reached a river, its waters churning over jagged rocks. The sound was a welcome mask to their movements. He crouched, touching the ground, reading the land as one might read a book. After a moment, he nodded. "We cross." Eleanor followed without hesitation. The water was freezing, seeping through her boots, numbing her calves. But she barely noticed. Her focus was on the other side, on the dense thicket that offered cover. They reached the far bank just as gunfire cracked behind them. Eleanor whipped around, heart leaping into her throat. Shadows moved through the trees on the opposite side, men pushing forward, weapons raised. "Go!" Tahanita ordered, already drawing his bow. Eleanor hesitated only a second before running. The forest blurred around her, branches clawing at her arms, roots threatening to trip her. But she didn't stop, not even when the gunfire grew louder, not even when the shouts rang through the trees. She heard Tahanita behind her, keeping pace, his breath steady. Then, suddenly, he grabbed her, pulling her down behind a fallen log just as another shot rang out, splintering with inches from where she had been. Her pulse hammered. Tahanita loosed an arrow in response, swift and precise. A pained cry followed. Then another. The gunfire ceased. Eleanor's breath came in quick, shallow bursts. She turned to look at him, at the calm steadiness in his gaze. She realized then that he had no doubts. He had seen her fear, her uncertainty, and he had pulled her through it without hesitation, because hesitation meant death. She swallowed hard, forcing her breath to steady. "What now?" Tahanita studied her for a moment, then gestured toward the dense brush ahead. "We keep moving." Eleanor nodded, and so they did. The world stretched before them, wild and untamed. It held no promises, no safety, but it also held something else, something Eleanor had never truly felt before, a future she could claim as her own. And for the first time, she did not run from it. She ran toward it.